Well, thank you very much. We have a very interesting session coming up, and Senator Ron Johnson is a perfect person to have us with us today. He's a former, maybe someday again, successful businessman, entrepreneur, ran a company for a number of years, helped build it up to a large size, and he also chairs the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Europe and Regional Security Cooperation. And I want to welcome everyone, and especially those watching Facebook live stream, so we have a larger audience. But to begin, Senator, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and the last 70 years has been phenomenally successful. No one could have dreamt we would have such success. We won the Cold War. We had Europe become integrated internally in a way that was a pipe dream a few decades ago. Yes, it has problems, but it's phenomenal what's happened there. NATO, the most successful alliance in the history, helped win us the Cold War. On trade, after the horrors of the 30s, trade wars, currency wars, we had GATT and then the WTO, World Trade Organization, reducing barriers. Between 1985 and 2005, global trade increased fourfold, thanks to containerization, supply chains that make possible these handhelds. But now, after such success, it seems all up in the air. Whether NATO, Germany buying gas from the Russians, people not doing the 2% of GDP. The EU seems to be unraveling. And on the trade front, tariffs, which is another word for taxation. People criticize us for leaving the Paris Accord, for the Iranian Treaty, medium-range missiles. You go down the list. So, from your perspective, how do you see the U.S. role evolving? Are we going it alone, or are these basic structures going to remain in place but are going to have some changes? Walk us through. 75 years of success, but it seems it's all up in the air.
Well, good morning, Steve, and good morning to everybody here. Oftentimes I say I'm not the most uplifting person. You ran down a list of some of the issues. It's a messy world. It's not a perfect world. But I know the title of this talk was American Leadership, Going at It Alone. If it's a question, I understand why the question's being asked. If it's a statement, I completely disagree with it. I was in the joint session of Congress when Secretary General Stoltenberg came and spoke to the joint Congress on the 70th anniversary of NATO, which has been the most successful defensive alliance in history. It has kept the peace. I don't know how many standing ovations the Secretary General got, but he started and he ended his speech with a pretty simple statement: it's good to have friends. And I would just modify that slightly by saying it's crucial to have friends. And again, I understand, based on rhetoric, some of the statements, America First, which I think has been misinterpreted. But I would argue
have that legacy from the 1930s, American isolation.
Yeah, we can talk a little bit. We can delve into that a little bit further. But from my standpoint, I'm a U.S. senator. I represent the first branch of our government, of our constitutional government, and I can unequivocally state that the most consistent branch of government, and by that I mean the longest serving member was John Dingell, 59 years in the House. Robert Byrd was the longest serving senator, 51 years. Both gentlemen spanned the 11 administrations. They served with 11 different presidents. So administrations come and go. Our Constitution does vest the president with enormous powers on national security, but Congress has a say in these things as well. And from the standpoint of the first branch of government, our commitment to NATO, to our European friends and alliances, is strong. It'll be long-lasting. Evidence of it is what we did in reaction to the courage of the Ukrainian people. People don't really recognize how extraordinary this was, but we voted unanimously for $300 million of defensive, lethal defensive weaponry for the brave and courageous people of Ukraine to counter Russian aggression. That is extraordinary. And I think it underscores and amplifies America's commitment to our alliances, to our friendships, and we do represent the Western democracies. We're not perfect, but I think we've been a phenomenal force for good in the world, and I think that will continue. It has to continue.
So you don't see a world in which everyone is in effect on their own, which is what we had before World War II, and it's fitting that we're meeting here, which was the center of the tragedy of 1938 with Munich, and then 1948 with communism, which led to the coup here, led to the rise of NATO, really was the spur to get it done. And so we're not going to go backwards.
No, I'm also chairman of the Homeland Security Government Affairs Committee. And as a business person, I actually do like mission and vision statements. And so one of the first things I did is I created a mission statement for our committee, pretty simple, to promote the economic and national security of America. I put economic first because, and again, to me, that is the whole American first. I think every elected official, their first duty is to their own nation. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just like your own duty as a human being is to yourself and to your family. And the combination of our Declaration of Independence with Adam Smith's Wealth of Nation, both written and published the exact same year, a limited government primarily designed to protect individual liberty and freedom, to allow people to aspire, to build, to innovate and create. Combine that with an economic model of the invisible hand. That's what's actually worked. And so if we concentrate on growing our economy, you have a successful and strong economy. Now you have the resources to maintain a strong military, national security, and again, NATO is a defensive alliance. It's not meant to go on offense unless it is threatened, unless it is attacked. That helps stabilize the world, but it starts with strong economies in each of our sovereign nations. There's nothing wrong with that. It's actually our first duty as elected officials, but that does not mean that we reject our alliances and our friendships. Again, I'll reiterate, it is crucial that we have friends, that we have these and maintain these strong alliances. They're going to evolve. There will be issues. We're different sovereign nations. There will be conflicts even at times, but we all have to understand what unites us is far more valuable, far stronger than what potentially divides us.
Do you feel that Europe, obviously a broad word, Europe has that same commitment with working with the U.S.?
Without a doubt. Article 5 has only been invoked one time, and that was when America was attacked after 9/11. And I am more than mindful, as Secretary General Stoltenberg reminds us, more than 1,000 of our NATO partners' sons and daughters have given their life, paid the ultimate price, the ultimate sacrifice in stepping up the plate to defend all of our liberty and freedom. So no, this is, we do as elected officials in America, we need to point that out to our public more often. But no, I think, again, we recognize how important this is. You know, I attended the earlier session, NATO, after 80 years, or in 80 years. We've already done the 7th anniversary, looking forward to the next decade. But, you know, the audience kept asking the question, okay, yeah, you talked enough about what unites us. You know, what are the problem areas? And the panelists just wouldn't go there. Because, again, what unites us is so much stronger than what problem areas or what issues we might have between nations.
You mentioned Article 5, and there's been concern that if, for example, if Russia puts pressure on the Baltic states, which it has, Article 5 would come into effect if they made a move. We wouldn't just wring our hands and say, well, what do those little countries matter?
No, absolutely. We would invoke Article 5 and we would come to their defense. We have to come to their defense. I have led resolutions after the Kerch Strait for a stronger response. I'm disappointed. We have not responded as strong as we should. I've called for a multinational freedom of navigation operation in the Black Sea to show when Russia, aggressively using military action, makes incursions into the West, does not abide by its own commitments in terms of the territorial integrity of Ukraine. We need to respond militarily as well, not with kinetic military action, but with a very strong show of strength and resolve. That's why I'm all for a greater NATO presence in Poland, in the Baltic states. The different initiatives we've engaged in there, I think those are extremely important, but we need to show greater strength and resolve.
In 2008, Russia made moves against Georgia, even though Georgia was not a member of NATO. We did take some military maneuvers that people felt saved Georgia itself, even though it lost two parts of it. The country itself did not get invaded.
As I understand it, a couple flights of some C-30s, nobody knew what was actually in those planes, but I think that was a strong enough signal to Putin and to Russia to stop. Now, unfortunately, those territories have not been returned, and Russia continues to be aggressive in Georgia as well. So, Steve, it's tragic. It's so unfortunate the path that Putin has chosen. As opposed to accepting our outstretched hand, as opposed to integrating Russia's economy with a more successful model in the West. I mean, Russia and its people would be so far better off if it cooperated, if it was no worse than a friendly rival, as opposed to right now, and let's face it, Russia is an unfriendly adversary and enemy, obviously, within Ukraine. Hopefully, Putin comes to his senses. I'm not going to doubt. I'm not going to sit and wait for that. Hopefully, whoever succeeds Putin will actually realize what's in the best interest of Russia and its people.
Why does Germany insist on buying gas from Russia, and we're now becoming the biggest liquefied natural gas producer in the world? It's just a matter of years. We can not give it, but sell it very cheaply, far more reliably. We're not going to use it for political purposes. What's happening with Germany? That's the linchpin.
Well, they're obviously looking out for their economic self-interest, which I just argued every nation should, but we have to do that within the context of what's good for our alliance. And long-term in terms of the geopolitical rivalry that is occurring right now. So we obviously oppose Nord Stream 2. We were very heartened by EU's Parliament in terms of their resolution opposing it. Hopefully we can stop the full construction of that, because I don't think that's in Europe's best interest.
But you think that's more of an outlier, not a sign that the whole thing is going to unravel?
I hope so, yes.
Good. Let's talk about trade. The word tariff has come up again. Tariff is another word for taxes. It was a disaster in the 1930s, starting with Smoot-Hawley in the United States, which put us into a global recession, and then that led to mistakes that led to a global depression, currency devaluations, beggar thy neighbor. Are we going to be able to move forward on reducing trade barriers, or are we going to see this seemingly arbitrary use of tariffs for this? You're mad about that, put on a tariff. Where's that going to lead? Because it leads to, as you know, as a business person, uncertainty. Investment CapEx, capital expenditures in the U.S. are now being put on hold because they want to know what the rules of the game are. And if an agreement is reached, it will be honored and not suddenly the rug pulled out from under them. Where are we going on trade? We were once the big free trader in the world.
Well, I'm an unabashed free trader, and I agree with you. I mean, tariffs are taxes on the consumers of the importing nation. I mean, that's just simply without a doubt. We know where the incidence of the tax lies on a tariff. President Trump has stated that he is looking for a zero tariff world, a zero non-tariff barrier type of world. He wants free, but he wants fair, and he wants reciprocal treatment. I personally think the Marshall Plan was probably one of the most inspired actions ever taken, and has been hugely beneficial. Sure, it was foreign aid to the European continent that needed at that point in time, but has been proven to be so beneficial to the entire globe, but in particular to the United States. So we need to look at that model. But I also think, as a result of the Marshall Plan, the result of America's generosity in terms of opening our markets to our trading partners, we have been taken advantage of. And it's been a system that's worked obviously very well for China, but also a number of our trading partners. We do have a huge trade deficit. I don't view that as a particularly worrisome metric. I know the administration does. I guess I'm just asking our trading.
They ignore the fact that capital flows into the U.S.
It actually does balance. If you have a trade deficit, you have a capital account surplus.
Actually, look at cash coming in, cash going out. It's not a problem.
It's zero.
And by the way, for those who are worried about trade deficits, which is an accounting artifact, in the U.S., we've had trade deficits for 350 out of the last 400 years since the Jamestown settlement. When you come to our country, look around you at the devastation these deficits have caused. Not. It's just part of well, not to belabor the point, but when you go to a restaurant, you have a trade deficit with the restaurant.
I was going to make the same point on a grocery store. And, enacting a tariff on myself because I have a trade deficit with the grocery store, I'm just going to increase my own cost of groceries. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So,
yeah, and then Forbes, shockingly, has had a trade deficit with its paper suppliers for 102 years. We buy more from them in paper than they buy from us in subscriptions. It's outrageous. I've got to do something about that.
But you have a trade surplus with your customers. That's how the world works. I think we need to recognize that China is the abuser of the trade worlding.
Well, that gets to something very important. He focuses, the president, often on deficits in his people, but there are very real trade abuses. China's not abided by the rules of the WTO. What are your thoughts on the most effective way of punishing or calling into action? And why do you think we didn't work with our allies here in Europe, Japan, and elsewhere who have the same problems with Chinese abuses? We could have presented a united front, and that would have, I think, gotten attention in Beijing.
I'm hoping that is what we will end up doing. He does have an agreement now, the USMCA, to replace NAFTA. That needs to be ratified. Hopefully we can conclude the trade talks with Europe, other trading partners, so that we can go as a united world and demand that China comply. I mean, their theft of our intellectual property through cyber theft, through espionage, through technology transfers, forced technology transfers, I mean, violation of WTO rules. And we all assume China, we made this assumption, if we welcome them into the World Trading Order, if they have greater prosperity, they'll become more democratic, more pluralistic, and it hasn't happened. So we need to watch China very carefully in terms of their, in many aspects, malign actions. It's unfortunate. I would like to have a win-win situation with China. Right now, they're winning. In some respects, we're losing. We need to recognize what strengths we have, but we're stronger, united, demanding that they comply.
And on tariffs, yes, they're hurt, but we're hurt too. Are there specific measures like censoring a company, barring particular companies, you know which one I'm referring to,
sure.
But there are others out there, or a bank that misbehaves, kicking them out of the SWIFT payment system, which would decapitate them? Are there specific measures that we should take instead of these broad brush tariffs that end up hurting both of us?
Well, again, from my standpoint, the most egregious abuses aren't going to be covered by any trade agreement. It is the cyber theft. It's the espionage. And I think our first line of defense in any kind of cyber security issue is exposure. The public needs to be aware, and what's happened over the last decade, as we've seen these high-profile cyber attacks, people are aware. In boardrooms now, the chief information officer, that's up at a boardroom type of level. That's incredibly important. So we need to call China out on this cyber theft. And I think that, quite honestly, is probably the first line of defense. But then we need to be aware. I mean, we're concerned about telecommunications. We're concerned about the national security risks that, if the world embraces Huawei, is that going to represent a security risk? Part of the issue there is it's incredibly complex. 5G, I attended that session. Most people aren't computer scientists. Most of us really don't understand the real technology here and the real technological risks that poses. But we need to be aware of it. Again, it's that first step in solving any problem is just awareness of it, admitting we have one. And I think we're starting to looking for some real solutions there.
There was a CEO of a major company several years ago who, when these attacks come, you can often see them. And they're monitoring these attacks. And they noticed that for 1 hour, they ceased. And they wondered why. And then they figured out these people are working for the government, and they were having their lunch break for 1 hour, and then the attacks would begin again. So it is government.
Those on cyber offense, they've got the lead. We may be closing the gap, but they'll always have the lead. So you're going to see more and more effort, more concentration on what we need to do in terms of cyber defense. I mean, one thing the United States government's doing is we're letting the world know that we may also take offensive action, and I think that's a pretty strong deterrent as well. We have great capabilities, and our adversaries need to understand that.
On trade, is it time to reform WTO? There's a feeling that people have found ways to get around those rulings, even though we win 85% of them when we bring an action. We modernized GATT in the 90s. Is it time, and is real concrete action going to be taken to upgrade in a digital age?
I think it's,
mechanisms?
Yeah, it's well past time. I've always felt the best way to enforce trade agreements is a very rapid adjudication process for trade abuse. Where you have obvious trade abuse, it's just that, it's obvious. And these issues, these claims should be settled very quickly. Because right now what happens is, yeah, we may win 85% of it, but the company's already bankrupt. It's already out of business. So you need to be able to adjudicate these things quickly enough so the companies actually survive that are really paying the price.
Do you feel that the U.S. government is now going to be moving to actually move ahead on trying to get the WTO up to speed?
I mean, I hope so. What's unfortunate about the trade negotiations with China is I thought we were, in the administration, every official we were talking to, we were so close. But then when we brought up the issue of enforcement, say, okay, you're agreeing to these things, enact it into law. And let's face it, China, can enact things into law far easier than we can in our Western democracies. And they balked. And what good is an agreement that's not enforceable, that you're not able to enact it in type of law? So, again, right now, it's in China's court. And I agree with the Trump administration that China is paying the heavier price here, but they also have a long-term strategic view, and I am concerned that they may take the position they'll just wait this out.
Yeah. Is there a way that we can go on offense on trade? You mentioned Trump says he wants a zero tariff. Is there any real move to begin, which I think would certainly have a good psychological impact, of beginning negotiations with the EU on maybe reducing barriers between the two?
It's certainly what I'd like to see. I would like to lead by example. But again, also asking and demanding of our trading partners, come on, let's lower trade barriers across the board, and let's engage in free and fair and reciprocal trade.
I guess the key here is people agree on that, but when are we going to take actual initiative of saying, here's a delegation, let's sit down, let's figure out what we can and cannot do?
Yeah, well, TTIP was an initiative, and election cycles come into play. The EU, just like in America, you have competing interests, sovereign nations versus sovereign states, and none of this stuff is easy, Steve, and you know that better than anybody.
TTP, Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. Somebody said change the first T to Trump. Maybe that would have gotten the thing off the ground.
Well, I'd much rather be engaged with the U.S. involved 40% of the world's market than be disengaged, be on the outside looking in.
On the EU, we encouraged what used to be called the common market. Now it's evolved into the EU, more integrated Europe. Why do you think the crisis has arisen? Why do we see the rise of extremes? We had a very good presidential election here in Slovakia, where that extremism was decisively repudiated. But in other parts of Europe, there's a feeling that forces are rising that are inimical to traditional democratic order. Why do you, from an outsider, what's the crisis, and what, if anything, the U.S. can do to ameliorate it?
Across the world, successful nations have also engaged in welfare systems that we've promised benefits you can't pay for. And some nations are able to cope with that better than others. And so you do have financial situations in these sovereign nations that put pressure on the body as a whole. You also had the migrant flow out of the Syrian conflict, just as we're seeing the migrant flow out of Central America. These are difficult issues to deal with, and it sparks political unrest, and there's a political reaction to it. So I think the combination of those two pressures, I think, is primarily responsible for some of the issues we're seeing throughout the European Union.
So it's immigration. Is it structural barriers economically that are contributing to the malaise?
Well, I mean, you realize I'm a limited government kind of guy. Private sector.
Never would have guessed.
Recognizing as a business person, really the harmful effect of over-regulation. Nobody argues for no regulation. You need the reasonable amount of regulation. But when you start over-regulating, and that is the tendency of government bureaucracies. They get power and they view themselves as the more intelligent, the better angel, and they've got to impose things on the private sector. That happens in the U.S. federal government. I think it's happened in the EU as well. So I think those federal governments, whether it's the EU Parliament or America's federal government, they need to be a little more modest. They need to recognize that it's a federation of sovereign states and sovereign nations, recognizing, as our founders did, that government is best closest to the governed. In Wisconsin, we can take care of Wisconsinites. We don't necessarily need a nanny state telling us what to do. And I think probably it's the same true in the sovereign nations within the EU. There are going to be differences, and I think those differences
so the
need to be
EU
respected.
doesn't have to define what is a banana, what is spaghetti. Those things can be left
the
to
EU
the
may think it
Italians.
does, but I would say some of the sovereign nations would probably argue against that.
Yeah. Talking about the EU in terms of regulations, I think it was in Australia, which obviously is not part of the EU, but there's this movement of, instead of these elaborate rules, go for basic principles. Like in nursing homes, I think in Australia, they used to have 4,000 pages on how you run a nursing home. Then they threw those pages out in 6 principles, like keep the place clean, basic things like that. And you know if you're doing it or not, even you don't need 1,000 rules to do it. And the result is they're better now than they were before with these rules. Is there a way in which you see the U.S. government leading by example on that?
Well, I would love to see that. Again, as I started as a business person with my committee, I create a mission statement. You try and keep it pretty simple. I would argue that we have 2 vision statements, one for America, one for the EU, that are pretty tried and true. In America, I've always argued that in the Declaration of Independence, we have probably the most wonderful vision statement for self-governance ever put down on a piece of paper. We hold these truths to be self-evident. I love that. It's just so obvious that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. I mean, take a look at that vision. Adhere to that. In the EU, it's a body, a federated group of sovereign nations, whole, free, and at peace. That's what we're trying to achieve. So stick to those first principles. Stick to those vision statements. Going back to, yes, there are things that divide us, but what unites us is so much more powerful.
Can you just quickly hit 2 things that are always thrown as the U.S. Going it alone? One is the Paris Accord on the environment, and the other is the Iranian nuclear deal.
Sure.
And some of us argue what we did there is not isolationism, but agreements that were seriously flawed. I mean, in the case of Paris, India and China got a free pass until 2030. Not fair. So walk us through those 2, that these
Sure.
are not signs of us retreating across.
Well, I know the European audience will not like my answer on climate change, but I actually
That's
agree.
why I saved it to the end.
I agree with Bjorn Lomborg, who heads
Yes.
up the Copenhagen Consensus. We have limited resources, and if your goal is to alleviate human suffering, there's a far better way of allocating those human resources. Climate has always changed. You go to the Vostok ice core sample, 420,000 years of recorded temperature history, 22.7 degree temperature variation. Men and women didn't exist 420,000 years ago. So something else, large forces are at play that cause climate change. Can man contribute to it? Sure. I don't deny that. But can man really spend hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars and hold back the tides? I would argue probably not, when the sea level in the last 20,000 years in the Bay of San Francisco has increased 360 feet. So again, there are better places to allocate resources. And my whole problem with the Iranian agreement was that put in the economy and the military of the largest state-sponsored terrorism, more than $100 billion. And we see Iran as the malign force throughout the Middle East, in Syria, into Lebanon, into Yemen. And why would we cooperate with that? Why did we not really demand that they really did come to the table in good faith?
Closing on that, this a little arcane for this audience, but the way the approval process went in the U.S. went against. You had to vote negatively on it instead of voting for the treaty. And
well, my amendment in that debate was we should deem this a treaty and require ratification. This was just an executive agreement, really not worth the piece of paper it was written on. And people and our European partners knew that as well.
Well, Senator, thank you very much. It's very reassuring. And now we're going to go straight into the next session on technology and governance. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Moderator Kevin Barron. Senator, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. We'll get some fresh water here.
Thanks.
Well, thank you to Steve Forbes and Senator Johnson for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us and sticking with us for our next chat. This is a half an hour with General John Allen. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Who literally just flew in.
I did.
So you're wide awake, you're ready to go. This audience is going to pepper you with questions.
That doesn't mean I answer any of them, but it just means I'll be happy to be peppered.
Once a general, always a general. That's what that means. So my name is Kevin Barron. I'm the executive editor of Defense One. The shorthand is I'm a Pentagon reporter. I've covered the Pentagon for about more than a decade now, and I'm now the editor of this news publication. Go visit us at defenseone.com. There's no paywall. We're free. That's my plug. And it means that I've known the general since, I don't know when, but at least since when you were ISAF commander, and as he's transitioned into the civilian world and now president of Brookings Institution. And they've given us the topics today on technology and the future of liberal democracies. We spoke briefly ahead of time, and we're talking about just last weekend, the big global security conference was the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, where you can bet we talked a lot about technology and democracies. Sure. And not just the big players, United States and China, but smaller countries in that region and around the world too, and how everyone is impacted. And one of the comments that was made on one of the panels there with General Nakasone, the commander of U.S. Cyber Command, and some of his counterparts, was that a panel on technology and on cyber 5 years ago had a positive tone. That there was something exciting about the future of technology as this new solution for a lot of our ills, whether it's security or soft power items or democracy. But now the panels are more about technology as a threat and what can be done to mitigate those threats and what the new threats are. And a lot of the alarm starts with the 5G story, but it's a lot deeper than that. So General, you said you've been working on these issues as well, and we can wade our way into them. And we want a lot of encouragement, a lot of participation from the audience, so don't be shy, think of your questions. You can use the Slido app. I've got my handy iPad here to navigate those if you want, or raise your hand and we'll get to those questions too in our half an hour. So technology and the future of liberal democracies, is this a positive thing or a negative thing, a threat to be mitigated?
Well, let me say a couple of things right up front. First, Kevin, it's great to see you again. I've written for Defense One a number of times over the years, and Defense One was one of the platforms in which we wrote together that set the conditions for the U.S. to go after ISIL a few years ago. You'll recall that. That was a really important role for Defense One.
I'll explain that moment. The phrase "destroy ISIS" came out of this man. It was an interview we had with him that a couple weeks later, an op-ed very early on in that conflict, where the idea being, this is a bigger deal than people realize that's happening in real time. And if you don't get after this enemy and this threat instantly and fast and in a big way, it's going to continue to grow. And sure enough, over the next couple of years, ISIS spread all the way down into Iraq. But that's a whole other story. You can talk about that if you want. I'll talk about it.
No. Look, I got hired because of that, because of that piece. You got to be careful what you write, I think.
You can talk about Afghanistan, and you name
Look,
it.
And the other thing I'll say is it's great to be back at GLOBSEC. This is an institution now. It's really come a very long way. We, for the first time this year, had a number of Brookings scholars attend, and we had events that were focused around some of the work we're doing at Brookings. And this is a partnership that we really think is important. GLOBSEC and this entity located on this piece of ground in the world is making an important statement, in particular, Kevin, to your point about democracy and technology. Look, there's a lot of good news on technology. And if you want to have panels on the good news in technology, the capacity of artificial intelligence and supercomputing and the algorithms that are being built to do good for humankind, I think is inestimable. I don't believe we can even begin to imagine, and at Brookings we think about the year 2070 a lot now, 50 years from now. What's the world going to look like in 50 years? And technology is going to play, if not a profound role, perhaps the preeminent role in shaping what that world will look like. So I think that when we begin to talk about technology and it trends immediately to the negative, I'm always very careful and often want to pull it back pretty quickly to the breakthroughs that we will see in medicine, the capacity that we'll be able to focus technology in dealing with climate change, how much we can do in terms of education, what we can do in terms of creating entire gig economies that we can't even imagine right now. So technology, including biotechnology, will be profoundly influential for the rest of this century. Okay, that's enough on that. Let's talk about the other side of it. I think that there's a real possibility that we will see, if we don't organize ourselves, and I think I heard Senator Johnson talking about it a bit, if we don't organize ourselves to understand what the effect of the emergence of technology can be in competition with the traditions of Westphalian sovereignty, we may find ourselves behind the power curve pretty quickly. And what we look at often at Brookings and in other fora is that the emergence of tech giants, many of which have GDPs that far exceed many of the countries in the world, the emergence of tech giants and their capacity to touch large segments of the human condition far exceeds often the capacities of the traditional Westphalian governments to be consequential in the lives of people. And you're beginning to hear the term digital citizen be used, where people will find that their relationship immediately with Facebook or with YouTube or with WhatsApp or whatever it might be is more consequential in their moment-to-moment life than is the government in the Westphalian capital 4 ridgelines over that has a weak judiciary, where women's rights don't matter, where citizens are shaken down at vehicle checkpoints constantly. And so we find that while technology is an enormously valuable asset to our people as we move into the 21st century, if we don't understand that there is an enormous dynamic, a tension that is emerging between the capacities for the tech giants to do their business and to influence humankind, and often it is at a direct consequence of the capacity of Westphalian governments to govern. Now, on the other side of the same coin, authoritarian states and increasingly illiberal states have been able to retain their capacities because of their ability to control their populations. And if you do the inventory, typically in authoritarian or totalitarian states, you have the party, whatever that looks like and however it's called, you have the military, and then you have the security services. And they tend to operate vertically with not much interaction between the silos, and they all sort of pyramid in either the oligarchy at the top or the individual leader at the top. So for authoritarian states, control of population is enormously important. So while liberal democracies are finding it difficult because the sovereign elected government in a democracy is in competition and in tension with the digital entities that operate at a flat level within the population. Authoritarian states have the advantage of harnessing technology to provide capacities to control that previously authoritarian or totalitarian states could never have imagined that they could do it. And for example, and I'm sure that's been mentioned here, the whole idea of the social index in China. The enormous capacity of China with respect to surveillance to have a sense, whether it's in the cyber domain or the physical domain, the capacity to gather enormous amounts of data, and through the supercomputing that the Chinese have really been able to accelerate in their own capacities in the last few years, to have a sense of virtually every single person in that society. And the social index, of course, is as you are assigned a number within the social index, your role in society ultimately either improves or decreases. Your privileges are greater or fewer. The future of your children is more or less based on where you fit in the big social index. And for me, when I took the Scholastic Aptitude test to get into college, I took them many times to try to get a better score. You can actually improve your social index score by taking tests that are based on your understanding of the role of the Communist Party and the traditions of Communist China. So those are two sides of the same coin. We have this huge tension in liberal democracies that technology can in fact be in competition with liberal democracy. And the other side of the coin, in authoritarian or totalitarian states, or even increasingly illiberal states, technology gives the capacity for the sovereign, if you will, and I use that in quotes, for the sovereign to have extraordinary capacity to surveil and to control the population. There, I think, is the rub, and there, I think, is the challenge that we face.
Well, thank you for all of that setup. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts and questions and listening to you. One, and often, you know, the quick response is, let's rank these. What are the threats that you're most worried about or less worried about? But before even getting to that, I want to ask you your thoughts on how we even talk about this moment and these issues, because I hear a lot of talk, even at conferences like these, that seems a little basic, a little maybe behind the curve. We know these are threats. We know these are also opportunities, and we know the wonders of technology that makes the world great, and we know the worries to come and that we're dealing with. I think you touched on it when you said that the governments are often behind the curve with the companies on what those concerns are or opportunities are. But the companies don't govern themselves often the way that the government needs them to, or that the public would need them to. And the case in point, at least where it's a security conference, I'm a defense reporter, in the last few months has been, in my mind, General Dunford calling out the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, the top military officer, calling out Google and saying flat out, if you provide help to a Chinese company with technology, that technology inevitably will end up with the PLA and will be used against the United States and its allies as a threat. Is that too cut and dry a way of thinking about it? Is that already behind the curve? Or is that the new way that needs the new kind of rhetoric and speech that we need to hear, that's much more frank and direct and confrontational, even if it's bad for business or exposes our dirty laundry in our own house about what technology companies need to do?
Well, one of the great things about a liberal democracy is that we often do expose the dirty laundry in our own house, because that's who we are and that's how we talk to each other. I have no objections with General Dunford making those kinds of comments, but I think it speaks to the point that the reality that we face today is that the relationship between the digital entities and the sovereign government of the United States is still quite distant. And the policy gap between those two is an area where we're, in fact, spending a good bit of time thinking about the kinds of policies that might be necessary, or the way you consider policy with respect to the relationship between government and the digital entities. And I think that, Google got itself into a situation where it had, as you recall, the code of conduct, or some guiding principles with respect to how it would relate to defense. what you find is, as you do the surveys across the various digital entities today, they're far more circumspect about their sense of their role with government. And as we continue to go on in this environment, we're going to see, I think, the consultation between those entities and government begin to increase and the distance decrease. Because there's just no possibility that we can go forward and have a confluence or a synergy emerge from our private sector, which really leads the world in the technologies. It's not the United States that's leading the world in many respects. It's our private sector that's leading the world. And for us to both secure our future in the context of mastering and employing technology to the advantage of our population and strengthening a liberal democracy, we've got to come closer. And I think and I know you've probably seen this, many of these companies are quite circumspect. They're quite introspective, in fact, in having the conversation about what they stand for. It's a really important conversation. What do they stand for? What are their ethics? How does what they do benefit humankind? And the conversation is increasingly trending towards how does what they do not just benefit humankind, but strengthen democracy. There are some of these companies that have entire segments of the companies which are in fact oriented 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on the strengthening of democracies and providing capacity in coded software to defend the democratic process of an election. That's a huge step forward, and that's exactly the direction we need to go. In the Chinese model, there's quite a blend between what might be called the private sector and state-owned enterprises and the party. I mean, there's no clear differentiation between them. There are clear differentiations between the entities and the governments in the liberal West, or I should say the liberal rest, because we often leave Japan and Korea out of this, and they ought to be deeply included in our conversation, because they're very successful democracies in their own right, with very powerful, technologically based democracies and economies. We should be finding ways or seeking to find ways where the government and those technology bases can find common purpose and common ground to move forward together.
We're already halfway through this session. Again, if you want to get on Slido, send a question up. We'll get that going, and we'll get to some audience questions next. So, what you're describing, thank you. What you're describing, again, is yes, governments and companies need to work together. Companies, some of them are working to strengthen democracy. It sounds like you're not as cut and dry, though, as the General Dunford's statement. Or think of other issues, even like with 5G. In some frames and how it's covered, or either how it's covered in the media or how folks are talking about it, 5G is either an absolute threat, there cannot be any interaction with Chinese technology, or it's too late, you only have so many options, it's got to be mitigated, and as long as you keep it off your Intel systems, it's okay. That sounds more like the conversation that's here in Europe, because here in Europe, they haven't been convinced of the American position that all things Chinese are bad. And I don't want to stick just to China, by the way. There's lots of other technology questions with democracy we can get to, including in the developing countries.
Look, I want to be very careful about moving down the road that says all things Chinese are bad.
Okay.
We first seek to find common ground where we can cooperate with China. And there's a huge number of areas in where we and other elements within the West ought to be finding ways that we can cooperate with China. And they're actually quite interested in cooperating with us on things like medical research and artificial intelligence for good, on climate, on space, on education. I mean, there are enormous opportunities for us to intersect for both our states, both our countries and our people's common values and common benefit. But we also have to expect that we're going to compete quite a bit. We call it the 4 Cs. So find ways to cooperate if you can. Recognize that you'll compete, but in competition, look for opportunity. And there is opportunity in competition. But also, at the same time as you're competing, you have to manage the 3rd C, which is confrontation. And the confrontation, I think, is where we generally find ourselves now, in confrontation. And then the last C is, above all other things, prevent conflict. So there's a difference between worrying about a Chinese telecom backbone over which is moving large amounts of your information versus 5G itself. 5G is a gift to humankind in the context of accelerating the capacity for the networking and the movement of massive amounts of information, and I think 5G will be enormously valuable to us. We haven't really broken the code yet on how we defend a 5G network, but it's not about 5G, to me. It's about permitting the network on which 5G will operate and the technological backbone and architecture to be the basis for the movement of information inside liberal democracies. That's what we should be worrying about. And I think that's really what Paul Nakasone and Joe Dunford's talking about. The selling point, and I hear it in Europe all the time, the selling point about Huawei and 5G is that it is convenient. The Chinese have made it convenient to go that way, and it's harder to go with other companies. It's not the 5G, it is the backbone on which 5G is coming that creates the crisis. And once that backbone is in place, it's going to be very difficult ultimately to rip that out and put something else in a substitute.
Let's go to some audience questions, and I wonder also, I want to plant a seed in your minds. Last night at our gala dinner, the theme was the anniversary of the Velvet Revolution, and the idea of what role technology is playing on the opposite side, the opportunity for democracies and opening up of new freedoms, new eras that didn't exist 30 years ago that are going to exist now.
And I think it's hugely valuable. Can I make just one quick point?
Sure.
I flew here straight from the board, the annual board that Brookings has, and we had a speaker at the board, and I'm conscious of Chatham House rule, but we had the Danish ambassador to Silicon Valley. What other countries has recognized that the future, ultimately, of technology in this tension with Westphalian progress recognizes that having a full-blown ambassador detailed with an embassy to Silicon Valley, with, by the way, a consulate in Beijing, this should make your head spin, because this is very different than the way we've thought about things in the past. And so for states to actually recognize that there is a sovereign dimension to these digital entities and to seek to bring them closer into the Westphalian concept at the same time we embrace the emergence of this technology, this is the leading edge of the conversation we have got to have right now if we're not going to have technology tear us apart from the inside as liberal democracies. This is exactly, Denmark's setting the path on this thing. This is exactly the way we should be thinking.
Okay, good. Let's go to the audience questions now. If we can keep your questions brief and your answers brief, we'll get a lot in our last 10 minutes.
I'll put a period right behind it.
Thank you. I'll try to address small challenges then. General, let's talk about the politically motivated attacks against the very core of our liberal democracies, and particularly election hacking. We know that the adversary is opportunistic and quite formulaic in being that. But for some reason, we consider that to be an unknown unknown. At the same time,
we consider that to be what is that, please?
the adversarial behavior.
Okay.
As if we can't model it and prepare against it. And at the same time, we believe that democracy is so slow that we can never respond to an opportunistic adversary. What would be your advice in managing risks so that we maintain our democratic values and routines and procedures, but at the same time we're as agile and reactive as the adversaries?
Well, your question, I think, points in some respects to the challenge that we have, and that is that democracies typically move very slowly. We have to recognize that in an environment where I spend much of my time during the day living in the cyber world as opposed to in the physical world, that we have to recognize that we have to secure the cyber world as much as we have to secure the physical world, and democracies have to think differently about it. If General Paul Nakasone was sitting here, he would tell you that we have spent a great deal of time at NSA and in our cyber commands and other organizations doing the diagnostics on what our opponents look like and creating the mechanisms both to defend ourselves and ultimately, if necessary, to strike out on the offense. Having the capacity for us to work together as a community of liberal democracies to prepare ourselves for this, I think, is completely reasonable. NATO, I think, has come a very long way since the 2016 summit in Warsaw, where it committed itself to this kind of work. But we're just too slow. And that's the problem that we have. It's much easier for our adversaries who are not constrained by popular votes.
Stop being slow. That's the question.
It requires political will. It requires political will to bring together the private sector, the security sector, and the people in these countries to explain to them what's at risk here. There aren't any bodies in the street bloody and lying in the street, and there aren't any buildings collapsing. But in many respects, the attack upon our democratic processes, which are elections, and our democratic institutions, which are shaped by corrupted elections, that is as much an act of war upon us as if they were shooting our citizens in the streets. We have to think differently about it. And our elected leadership has to understand that the future of liberal democracy depends on our capacity to defend ourselves in the cyber domain. It's not just a physical process now. So democracies are going to have to think differently about it. I don't have the solution for you, but I can tell you that if we don't do certain things, it's going to get much worse for us, because we'll continue to be attacked in 2018 just as we were in 2016, we're going to be attacked in 2020. But in 2018, one of the reasons that we didn't have a broader, more obvious result from those attacks was that, in fact, President Trump permitted our security forces on a cyber basis to take steps that were necessary to defend the American electoral process.
Well, General,
we've got to think that way.
I was going to steer you toward that, and my thought is, as a reporter, we cover what the leaders say, and if the leaders aren't making this a top priority, or in the case of President Trump, rejecting the story altogether, it's hard to have that sense of urgency that you're calling for.
Right.
But at the same time, you are right. He did permit is a good word, if not instruct, all the U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies to actively defend and do whatever they needed to do to protect that election. He didn't interfere with it. He just stood by the sideline and tweets pot shots at it. Let's get to another question if we can and keep moving because we're short of time. This gentleman in the front had his hand up earlier. We'll try to come over here and then back this way. But within 5 minutes, so please let's keep it quick.
Thank you. Robin Shepherd, Vice President of the Halifax International Security Forum. Thank you, gentlemen, for a terrific discussion. What I think is particularly refreshing is that while we have to deal with the threats, we're also talking about the opportunities. And that's exactly in that vein that I want to approach this question to you, General Allen. You talked briefly but interestingly about how tech companies and how we can use tech to improve existing ways in which we do democracy and governance. What you haven't talked about, and people very rarely do, is whether technology should be used to alter the way we do governance at all. Things like hybrid government, bringing in more people, elements only perhaps at this stage of direct democracy. Is that where your thinking's going, or is that for you a step too far?
No, it's not a step too far. In fact, it is exactly the direction we should be going. Artificial intelligence and supercomputing and the right kinds of algorithms, which are it's a troika that has to exist together, gives us the capacity for either decision assist or decision support by the ingestion of huge amounts of data that we could never have had before. And to your point, which is a very good one, if we want to accelerate the capacity of democracy to both sense and to see and to react to conditions that democracy should be, the ability to use big data analytics and predictive analytics and to have decision assist and decision support mechanisms be inherent in the process of making decisions in democracies. This can accelerate our capacity to both react and ultimately to anticipate the challenges that we will face. So I absolutely believe that there is a role for technology, big data analytics, artificial intelligence in accelerating the capacity of our national decision makers and if you will, the ministries and departments to be far more efficient. Now, there'll be an employment issue here. We can solve that. But if we can accelerate the rate that democracy can operate, I think that's a very good thing, and it is completely possible.
That's good. So AI is not all Terminator and bad robots. There is hope for it.
Oh, no. Look, we can talk about hyperwar if you want to, and that keeps me up at night.
We'll get to that. However, I think this will be our last audience question before we transition to our next panel. Right here in the front. I'll get out there.
Agnia Grigas, Atlantic Council. I wanted to ask if you think democracies are in their nature more vulnerable in the digital age because of our open societies, open media, open elections. And overall, are you more optimistic regarding democracies in this digital age, or are you more cautious?
In that answer, I'll add, think of the developing countries as well that are in between, whether they're democratic or not, and have the future to who to decide who to go with?
The challenge that we have, because that's a wonderful question. The challenge that we have is we have centuries of development in this part of the world, relatively sophisticated democratic institutions. And now we have the rise separately and often in tension with, because it's the private sector, digital capacity. And the two remain in tension. Having now listened to the soul searching that's going on in American digital entities on what they stand for, what values do they embrace, and ultimately, are they good for society or bad for society? Those are powerful conversations. I am optimistic. But if we didn't see the private sector coming towards the government, I would see, in the end, the long-term difficulties associated with the spread of illiberalism. Now, illiberalism, as we have seen it grow here in Europe and in other places, just flew in from one. There's a whole series of globalization issues and equal rights issues and migration issues and all kinds of nativist political movements that account for illiberalism. But illiberalism can be accelerated, and the deterioration of democracy can be magnified by technology if we're not very careful. I'm optimistic. I think the trajectory, while slow and extraordinarily painful, has put us on a road where we can find that technology and democracy can, in fact, strengthen our institutions rather than ultimately weaken them.
You know, I think we hear often, if you work with intelligence professionals and cover security professionals, the history of democracies is, as you're implying, the blessing and the curse. The blessing is it's open society. The curse is you have to be an open society, and you're always at some sort of disadvantage in some areas, but ultimately, theoretically, you're not, because nothing can be better than democracy, right? It's
exactly right.
The worst form of government except all the others.
That's exactly right.
We have to wrap up, I'm told. You know, and sometimes you get sat next to a bad dinner guest and the conversation seems to go on forever, and other times it just flies by, and this seemed to have flown by for me. I hope for you as well. We could talk a lot more. I'm sure the general would love if you grab him through the halls and talk his ear off the rest of the day. Good luck trying to do that if you do. We're going to bring on the next panel, which is the space race and hybrid threats, with our moderator, Patrick Tucker, sitting over there, who just happens to work with me at Defense One and is our technology editor. And as you come to this stage, Patrick, I'd love to know your thoughts on the subject that we're talking about, because you live and breathe and cover it. In the meantime, please a round of applause for General Allen.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think I just go ahead and sit here. I need this. Yes, I do. Thank you. Yeah, you keep that. I keep this. All right. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. I do love that so much. We had John Allen on this stage last year. I interviewed him and a couple of other guests on the subject of artificial intelligence, and it's impossible to understate the importance of that to the future. But that's the thing about a conference like this. There's so many topics of such vital relevance to the entire future, and it's hard to get a handle on all of them. So with that, I'd like to ask Ambassador Soren Dukaru from the European Union Satellite Center to join me on stage. And we're going to have a discussion right now on the future of space and hybrid threats. So the thing to understand about this, and you grew up with the idea of space being something that government agencies sent people to go and investigate and explore, and all of that is wonderful. But the relevance of space to everyone in this room, everyone beyond this room, and everyone beyond them is absolutely enormous. Every time you take out your phone to find things, you're using a satellite constellation that's developed either by the US military or European partner or an Eastern European partner or somewhere else to find things. But also, if you engage in any sort of stock trading, if you have a retirement account that has that, if you use an ATM, then you're also relying in part on a timing signal that also comes from space-based constellations. And so this is technology now that basically provides structure for the entire international economy and really all of modern life, because it also helps with navigation of airplanes and certainly logistics all over the world. And again, like every financial transaction. And so one of the things that we're here to discuss today is how that's going to grow, and also how fragile that is. And if you want a sense of how fragile it is, and this is what we're going to get into because Ambassador Karu is a preeminent expert on this, but I can share an experience of my own. Go to Schriever Air Force Base in Colorado, where the US actually steers the global positioning system, the satellites that provide that timing function and also the navigation function for so many economic transactions all around the world, and also all humans getting from one place to another, and all Ubering and lifting, et cetera, et cetera. And in this room, at Schriever Air Force Base, there's about 5 airmen that actually run the thing. One that sort of watches for anomalies, 3 that steer it, 1 that sits over that airman's shoulder. The room is pretty cold. It's about 10 degrees colder than what's outside. They have to keep it this cold because the computers that they're working on are so old that they run hot. You know, like your phone, if you don't replace the battery for a little while, it starts to run hot. That's this entire room that steers the global positioning system for the United States. And the computers that these airmen are working on, many of the actual monitors and frames, they look older than the airmen, who average an age of about 22, 23 years old. So that's the entire stock market, all GPS, and basically the entire global economy is reliant on systems like that. And as we're going to talk here in a second, our reliance on these space-based assets is only going to grow. So first, give me a sense really quickly of what you do at the center so that we can understand then how to discuss this growing dependence that we're all going to be having.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, and I'd like to thank GLOBSEC for having me again, and also for this question that allows me to express how I landed here. And I should start by saying that I have about a 15 years career in the transatlantic world, the NATO world, and 6 days career in the EU world since I just took up the job at the beginning of the month. So bear with me. I'm addressing this mainly for the perspective of my expertise, someone who was focused in the last period on the 2 spaces that I feel express the technological gold rush of our time. One is cyberspace, and I've did that a lot of stuff with NATO. The other one is outer space. And by the way, there's a fundamental interlinkage because it's about sensing data and everything goes, it's like strong connection.
Yeah.
What I'm doing, the European Union Satellite Center has a couple of functions. It's an intergovernmental agency.
Right.
It belongs to the member states. And it has the function of using satellite data, mainly some from government systems, high resolution, high sensitivity data, but also commercial satellites, and also data from other sensors like UAVs, so-called high-altitude pseudo-satellites that are scanning for Earth observation purposes, giving the situational awareness globally. And it's used for taking decision in foreign policy, in crisis management for operations, but also aspects like management of frontiers. Frontex, for example, is a great user. OECE, the OECE mission in Ukraine benefits from data from this center. Also OPCW for the aspects that have to do with the non-proliferation issues and so on. But then there are a couple of other functions that have to do intrinsically with space security, like space surveillance and tracking. The Satellite Center is the entity that does this function for the European Union and its member states. It also provides security functions for the European Union Commission space program, from communication, government satellite communications to Galileo, GPS, so all these aspects, and
Okay, so we touched on a couple of them. Give me a sense of how our dependence on space-based assets is going to grow in the next 5 years, both from a government level and also in terms of all of these new services that businesses are looking to push out to consumers as quickly as possible. What does 5 years from now look like in terms of our interaction with space?
Our dependence from space is already extremely profound, and you mentioned it. It's going to be like like breathing the air. Let me give you another comparison. Comparing with the cyber domain, with the digital domain, with the Internet of Things, the 5G and so on, everything in our life is touched by this service. And now, all these aspects, in order to have global connection, are somehow linked with a space. It could be low altitude, medium, high altitude. You can have satellites just as relays, or you can have satellites as sensors or for communications. It's unimaginable. The weather, all our communication lines, I would say, productivity of agriculture. The urban planning is done today through the space, through satellites. The aspects linked to transportation. Even scanning deep in the air using spectral technologies, because the sun or different kind of light is reflected differently through different materials. You can understand the kind of earth crust by watching it from space, volcano, earthquake. So all these aspects of our lives will be linked to, and are linked to space, and will be the order of magnitude. I think in the short run, which when I say a couple of years, 5 years, it's going to be tripled. I mean, just
triple.
Yeah, and in the long run, we're speaking about longer run, medium run, 10 years, with like order of magnitude. Just to give an example, there was a recent news that Amazon, Jeff Bezos, will launch next year about 3,840 plus satellites. This is huge. I mean, this is usually, it was a fraction what one government was launching just a couple of years ago.
So what shifts by an order of magnitude of 3 is U.S. presence in space, just the amount of manned things that are in space creating new services and dependency. Is that what triples in 5 years or so?
You know, we create this to make our life more efficient, our economy is more productive, but of course, every infrastructure we create, we create our dependence. We increase our dependence to it. So if we're not taking care of its security, then you transform an asset into a vulnerability.
Well, so now you're getting ahead of me, because the thing that I want to ask you, and I think that is so vital for this audience, is if the dependency is growing and you see all of these new startups that are getting to space as quickly as possible, there's a company right now called Rocket Labs, and they're advertising about a $5 million launch price in by 2030 or so. $5 million for a launch I mean, this is revolutionary. And they're hardly alone in that space. There's a lot with 3D printing and other things. There's lots of things that are going to and expand this presence in space. What are the big threats that you see to that growing dependence? Because, as you point out, we're using this stuff more and more, but you also track space debris and things like this. How fragile is this right now?
Well, I would categorize the two types of challenges, threats and challenges. One that can unintentionally generate security problems and functionality and so on. Others that intentionally can generate these problems. So those and let's look at these space systems in their kind of broader context, which means connectivity between the ground-based command center or management center, then the communication link to the space asset, to the satellite, and then the link back that can be from space to users.
Yeah.
So one should always have in mind this triangle.
So now I'm thinking of three specific points that need protection.
Exactly, and their communication links in between them. So you can have vulnerabilities or unintended consequences in space coming from natural causes, like sun radiation, which is monitored, by the way, and can have specific effects. Space debris, and space debris can, space objects, and they could be meteorites, different sizes and so on, that are monitored, and space surveillance and tracking means an advance notice so the satellites actually move away when they're coming. But then there's the debris from old satellites that, aged, they lost controls. Some of them collided, or even situations where they were shut down. And we can come to like 3 important examples over the last decade or so. Now, this debris is already creating a huge problem because it's hard to address it. Mostly, I mean, there are a couple of technologies that have been imagined, some even tested, like harpooning an old satellite to take it out of, I mean, to bring it to some control. Very costly.
Yeah.
There's another one like using, that has not been fully tested, like using nets to absorb, but you can only use it for objects with low velocity and so on. Most of the objects are not so big.
Yeah.
You know, small, like a baseball, or
yeah.
And have huge velocity. A baseball with 7 kilometers or 3 kilometers even per second,
yeah.
it could significantly damage a satellite, a functioning satellite.
So let me see if I
so the only way is like to go out of their trajectory, but which means monitoring, using the satellite's fuels, stuff like this. And if this grows, like I said, 3 times and so on in the near future, it will create even more problem.
Okay, so to sum up, let me understand correctly. Our dependency on space is growing exponentially. The manned presence in space is growing exponentially. The amount of debris from these satellites that we're going to be putting into space, because they're linked, right? The presence of human presence in space in terms of all these satellites, and then the trash that they create, that they put into orbit, they're linked on the same thing, so those are also going up. And our best defense against them right now is highly complex satellite maneuvering and space nets?
They're not tested fully at the space nets.
Not untested space nets. Okay.
So the conclusion is quite simple.
Yeah.
We should make sure that we reduce this debris. By the way, with time, some debris, especially in low orbit, they're going to be attracted by the Earth gravity, and then they're burned out in space and so on. Mm-hmm. But not with in every case, and in some cases it could take not just months, it could take years for them to be absorbed by gravity and burned in the atmosphere. So the best scenario is to establish a regime whereby those assets sent to space, once they're approaching their life, the end of their lifetime, there are some mechanisms whereby they could be either collected or actually guided back towards, let's say, towards the graveyard, which could be, spot on the ocean or so on, and in a very controlled manner. Otherwise, if they're blown up or if they collide, they create even more space debris.
Is that anything that we're close to actually putting into place, that sort of regulatory?
Exactly, no, absolutely. So, it's like collecting your trash. It should be civilized. We cannot really keep our space
well, I know, but what I'm asking is, if that's a piece of regulation that has to come into existence, who is creating it and when?
Well, as far as we know, when we speak about regulation of our space, there are a couple of important agreements. One has to do with security, the famous Outer Space Treaty from the late 60s that really is focused on the peaceful use of space. Then there's one on rescuing astronauts or objects in space.
Registration.
Then there's one on liability of damage done from space assets, and then it's registration, like you mentioned. Now, if I'm not mistaken, when it comes to registration, there are certain obligations with this registration of launching satellites. But I think, like in every domain, because of the growth in numbers, because of extra technological possibilities, there's important to have updates of this aspect. So in the registration, there are provisions to make sure that the satellites do not become harmful objects. But I think we need to look into, to keep everything up to date.
Okay. So please send your questions to Slido if you'd like. The code for this session, GLOBSEC 2019, we're in the Danube space. And we have one here. India recently conducted an anti-satellite test, which created a substantial amount of debris. While this test has been criticized, there's no treaty preventing it. What can be done to minimize debris in space? And I think we've touched on some of the technical aspects of minimizing debris, but this brings up the question of basically the subject of the 1967 Space Treaty, which was what can militaries do in space? And there's a provision that expressly prohibits nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. But beyond that, there's really wide open space. And if you talk to, I can tell you, if you talk to folks in the United States military, like Dr. Michael Griffin, who's the current Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, they'll be very frank. They'll say the weaponization of space is a thing that has happened, that the Chinese did it in 2007 with their anti-satellite test, that the Russians have done it. And what they mean is missiles that have gone into space to blow things up, and also, in the case of Russia, potentially a satellite that is in space that might have some maneuvering capability that could be offensive. So what is your opinion on this? First of all, is the weaponization of space a thing that has happened? And if it hasn't happened yet, will it? And if it can be avoided, how does that happen?
Well, let me first start. I mean, as an EU official, saying that the EU is very much into the peaceful use of space and actually has as a strategy to increase its presence in space. It has a strategy to have more strategic autonomy on these aspects, has a space program and the project to grow it with in the coming years with the multi-year financial framework that is discussed. But let me go beyond this, my European hat, and respond to this with my analyst or my scholar hat in this field. So on a personal basis. I think we should first have a distinction between what it means militarization of space and weaponization of space.
Yes.
And let's be clear, militarization in also other domains means using even cyber and so on with some purpose that support the military. Like you can have intelligence observation from space. It supports the military. You have military communication instruments. Right. But this is not weaponizing. And a lot is militarized. Every domain is militarized, but it's different from weaponizing.
Yeah.
So I think while one could say there's a lot of military, there are a lot of assets with military use in space. I think states have been, at least until recently, quite cautious with the aspect of weaponization. Now you're right. There is talk of developing also going in this direction, especially since the Outer Space Treaty from 67, we checked it together. Actually, yes, the spirit is like use the space for peaceful means, but then it has specific focus on interdicting any placement of nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. It's not specific on other kind of like precision-guided. So it's not specific, although most of the interpretations are that, yes, it is about peaceful use of space. So we'll see how lawyers would see it. I think that this kind of cautious attitude should continue. I think that also it's interesting that, as far as I know, there are only 3 main examples of, for example, of shooting down satellites from the air with anti-satellite missiles. There's the Chinese event in 2007, which was high altitude, 800 kilometers, and generated huge debris. According to my information, about 3,000 pieces that will have a very long time span of years in space. There's another one by the US in low altitude in 2008, with a little debris, about 200 pieces that have been absorbed by Earth and burned in atmosphere in a couple of months. And the recent one by India, in the, I think, 280 kilometers, so still low atmosphere, with the 400 or more pieces of debris, and the expectation is that they will last a couple of weeks, months, and so on. I think the global community needs to be careful in sending the messages of treating this space with the sensitivity that it deserves. And again, I'm making some comparisons with the other one, with the cyberspace. The idea of thinking about some principles, some norms, not affecting the core assets. that would affect our life. This is all very important. But again, I cannot be Houdini. I cannot be fully predicting how this will evolve. But I think the caution that we saw until now on the weaponization, I hope it will continue somehow.
Let's take some questions from the audience. We have one right here. Okay.
Thank you very much. So my name is Nadia Al-Fatasi. I used to work almost 20 years at NATO. So my question is more related to your ex-NATO head. As we saw when cyber was recognized as operational domain, it took a while, and now they're navigating it. What are your views how we can prepare NATO, but the security institutions, for recognizing space as an operational domain?
Let me mention first that the steps that NATO took in the cyber domain have been also quite measured. And I remember when I took the NATO Assistant Secretary job in 2013, I was even criticized that it was too much focus only on resilience. And why doesn't NATO recognize the real militarization, weaponization, and address it? And there were incremental steps because nations wanted to do this right, not to accelerate or create an arms race, and even if NATO has linked cyber defense with collective defense with Article 5, even recognizing the cyber as an operational domain, it has done it for defensive purposes, and even if it considers also offensive action for defensive purposes, it's done under very strict regulations, principles, and so on. So coming back to your question, making this comparison, first, NATO does not yet have a space policy. There is a discussion on this, and I know that there isn't that. And this policy will address a lot of aspects, focused on the security aspect, but I think it will take some time, and it will be taken with a huge sense of responsibility. So don't expect rushing too much into this. But there is recognition of the utility of space for security.
Okay. Let's try and take another question, if we can, real quick, from the audience. And we have one on Slido that I want to get to as well. Since space is important to our daily life, how come we have not seen an international regime? Is it lack of awareness among policymakers, or is it competition between states? So this is in part, informing a potential regime is a potential aspect of the future work of the center without making policy, informing policymakers about the potential for international policy, perhaps.
And thank you for mentioning, I'm not in the policy making business, but I actually bring awareness that influences this.
So why not? Why have we not seen an international regime?
I think we are just so far the space presence has been dominated with relatively measured presence by state assets.
Yes.
And states had the feeling that the Outer Space Treaty Convention of the late 60s was pretty much a solid base. And you know how difficult it is to create new treaties. Like the United Nations on the Law of the Sea Convention, UNCLOS took more than a decade or so on. So they felt that it is fine. But I think this question is extremely legitimate because we're in a different moment. We're in a kind of putting money in the sense of the participation of the private sector as an important player in this area. Very much, again, like in cyberspace. So I think it has it will obligatory be a push both for states, but also with the participation of the private sector players to influence this process of creating a regime. So principles, norms, confidence-building measures, and a kind of framework whereby the accountability of respecting these norms will be checked.
Yeah. So this is great. So basically, as you start to introduce private players into this mix, and there's a real potential for people to lose money, then all of a sudden there's advancement and acceleration in norms and regulation to prohibit damaging other assets in space.
That's a perfect point, because it has to do with implicating governments who are still the sovereign players into the kind of regulation that would not put a brake on technological development, but also make sure that the assets are safe. So we're not throwing into space such assets. And I think you'll see a lot of focus on this in the near future.
Okay, let's take, if there's one more question from the audience. We've got a little bit of time right here. Last question, go ahead.
Christian Wierschitz, Austrian Television. I mean, I have no idea really how this works, but can you explain if private companies, states are launching satellites? Is there any kind of coordination which orbit? I mean, as it was not so frequently, it is not a problem, but how is this coordinated? Right. Can you just explain it a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Also, we have very little time. So
that's part of the registration agreement. So when you register the launch, it's very clear that you cannot just you launch it like you get a frequency from television, so on. It's on orbit. It could be geostationary, or they could have a special orbit and so on. So this is part of the registration treaty. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, please, everybody. First, lunch in the relative safety of the hotel for about an hour. 1 hour later, back here, Prime Ministers of Czechoslovakia and Slovakia, join me in thanking my guest, Ambassador Søren Dokkerud. Thank you very much.
Thank you.